June 27, 1988. A trailer park in Live Oak Springs, California sits quiet under the morning sun. Inside one mobile home, the floor has been scrubbed clean. Too clean. A bloody pillow lies in the corner. A screwdriver rests on a counter. An electric heater with exposed wires sits disconnected. And Irene Melanie May, a 23-year-old mother of three, has vanished without a trace. No body. No blood evidence that law enforcement could find. No proof she's even dead. Yet 7 years later, Carrie Lynn Dalton would be sentenced to death for her murder. This is the story of a crime that happened in the shadows, where the only witnesses were those accused of committing it, and where the question of what really happened that night would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. Irene Melanie May grew up in California, raised in a middle-class household that looked stable from the outside, but felt fractured from within. Her father was emotionally distant, absent in the ways that mattered most. Her mother loved her fiercely, but ruled with strictness, trying to hold together what was falling apart. The family dynamic created an environment where Irene felt both protected and suffocated, loved and misunderstood. She was a bright child with potential, but the emotional abandonment from her father left scars that would influence her choices for years to come. By the time Irene reached high school, she had started experimenting with drugs. It began innocently enough, the way it does for many teenagers, testing boundaries, searching for something she couldn't name. What started as occasional marijuana use at parties gradually evolved into something more serious. She discovered methamphetamine, and the drug offered her an escape from the emotional pain she carried. The high made her feel powerful, confident, free from the weight of her family's dysfunction. But that experimentation eventually led to dependency, and what had once been a choice became a need. At 20 years old, Irene married Bobby May. He was 25 when they met, a local guy who had grown up in the same town. Bobby had his own troubled past, struggling with anger issues that sometimes got him into trouble. As a teenager, he had racked up charges for petty crimes, nothing violent but enough to mark him as someone who didn't always make the best decisions. But beneath the rough exterior, Bobby genuinely loved Irene. He saw something in her that reminded him of himself, someone trying to escape a difficult past, someone who deserved better than what life had given them so far. Together, Irene and Bobby had 3 children. For a while, they tried desperately to build something resembling a normal life. They got an apartment in Lakeside. Bobby worked when he could find employment. Irene stayed home with the kids, dreaming of stability and a future where their children wouldn't have to witness the struggles their parents faced. But addiction and financial instability followed them like shadows they couldn't outrun. The methamphetamine use continued for both of them, creating a cycle of highs and lows that made consistent parenting nearly impossible. Despite everything, Irene loved her children deeply. She was strong-willed and fiercely protective of them, even when her addiction made her unreliable. She would have moments of clarity where she could see what her life had become and what it was doing to her family. During those moments, she made promises to herself and to Bobby that she would get clean, that she would be the mother her children deserved. But addiction doesn't respond to willpower alone, and the promises became harder to keep as time went on. The financial instability grew worse. Bills went unpaid. Rent became impossible to cover consistently. Bobby's anger issues led to more trouble with law enforcement, and eventually, the couple lost custody of their 3 children. Child Protective Services determined that the environment was unsafe, that the drug use and instability posed too great a risk. The children were placed elsewhere, and Irene's world shattered. She became desperate to reclaim custody, to prove that she could be the mother she wanted to be. But proving stability while trapped in addiction felt like an impossible task. Cheryl Ann Baker was 32 years old and had been friends with Irene for some time. An African-American woman who had grown up in a system of hardship, Cheryl learned early how to survive in difficult circumstances. Those survival instincts had served her well in some ways, helping her navigate dangerous situations and difficult relationships. But those same instincts also made her vulnerable to manipulation by people who understood how to exploit her fears. By her 20s, Cheryl had become addicted to methamphetamine. The drug culture created a community of sorts, a network of people who understood the highs and lows, who didn't judge the lifestyle because they were living it themselves. Cheryl formed friendships within that community, including her friendship with Irene. She was loyal to those she considered friends, sometimes to a fault. That loyalty meant she would go out of her way to help, would show up when called, would stand by people even when it might not be in her best interest. But that same loyalty could be weaponized by those who understood her need for belonging and her fear of abandonment. Cheryl had known hardship her entire life. She had learned not to trust easily, but once she did trust someone, that trust ran deep. She saw Irene as someone who understood struggle, someone who was trying to survive in the same harsh world. Their friendship was built on shared experiences and mutual support, even when that support sometimes enabled destructive behavior. Carrie Lynn Dalton was 39 years old and had known both Irene and Cheryl through the overlapping circles of the local drug community. Carrie had survived a difficult childhood herself, though the specific details varied depending on who told the story. What was clear was that Carrie carried with her a history of arrests and substance abuse that stretched back years. She had been in and out of trouble with law enforcement, accumulating charges that painted a picture of someone who struggled with authority and conventional social norms. Carrie was manipulative in ways that weren't always immediately obvious. She had a kind of charisma that could draw people in, make them feel special or important. But that charisma was paired with an ability to exert control over those around her through a combination of charm and intimidation. She understood people's weaknesses and knew exactly how to exploit them. She saw the world through a lens of paranoia and jealousy, constantly watching for signs of betrayal or disrespect. Carrie believed that people were always threatening her, taking from her, plotting against her. And when she felt wronged, real or imagined, she believed she had not just the right, but the duty to exact punishment. Carrie had a worldview where loyalty was everything and betrayal was unforgivable. She demanded absolute allegiance from those in her circle, and any perceived disloyalty triggered intense reactions. She could be generous one moment and vicious the next, keeping people around her constantly off balance, never quite sure which version of Carrie they would encounter. This unpredictability was itself a form of control, making others hesitant to challenge her or refuse her demands. Mark Lee Tompkins was Carrie's boyfriend, a man in his mid-30s with his own criminal record and history of substance abuse. Mark was physically imposing, the kind of man whose presence alone could intimidate. He had the build of someone who had done physical labor, with hands that showed years of hard work. His criminal history included various charges, nothing as serious as what he would eventually be accused of, but enough to establish a pattern of someone who lived outside the law. Mark often followed Carrie's lead in matters both large and small. Their relationship dynamic was clear to anyone who spent time around them. Carrie made decisions, and Mark carried them out. He was driven by loyalty to her, a loyalty that seemed to override his own moral compass at times. But Mark was also driven by fear, specifically fear of authority and fear of consequences. He had spent enough time in jail to know he didn't want to go back, which created an internal conflict between his loyalty to Carrie and his desire for self-preservation. That conflict would become crucial later in the story. Despite his intimidating appearance, people who knew Mark described him as someone who could be reasoned with when Carrie wasn't around. He wasn't inherently violent in the way some criminals are, always looking for confrontation. Instead, he seemed to become violent when directed to do so, when Carrie pushed him toward action. This distinction would matter when prosecutors later tried to understand the dynamics of what happened and who bore primary responsibility. There was also a man known only as George. His full identity was never confirmed, never recorded in official documents. No one seemed to know his last name, or if they did, they weren't sharing it with investigators. George was part of the friend circle and was present during key moments of this story. A shadowy figure who moved through events without leaving the kind of paper trail that would allow law enforcement to track him down later. He represented the unknown, the loose thread that investigators could never quite pull tight. His presence added a layer of uncertainty to everything. Because if George was there and participated, but was never caught, what else might have happened that no one knows about? And then there was Joanne Fedor, a mother of two who lived in the Live Oak Springs trailer park. Joanne was living an ordinary life, working to support her children, navigating the challenges that come with single motherhood and limited resources. She wasn't involved in the drug culture that connected the other people in this story. She was simply someone who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The night of June 26, 1988, would transform her from an ordinary resident into a crucial witness whose testimony would become central to a murder trial years later. On June 25, 1988, Irene Melanie May was evicted from her apartment in Lakeside. The eviction came after months of missed rent payments and complaints from neighbors. Her husband Bobby was in jail at the time, having been arrested shortly after they had lost custody of their 3 children. The arrest was for charges related to his ongoing struggles with anger and impulse control, leaving Irene to face the eviction alone. She found herself with nowhere to go, her belongings scattered, her life in complete upheaval. The apartment had been her last connection to normalcy, the place where she had tried to maintain some semblance of family life even after losing her children. Now even that was gone. Cheryl Baker was with Irene during the eviction, helping her gather what belongings could be salvaged and figure out where to go next. Both women were using methamphetamine that day, the drug providing energy and numbing the emotional pain of the situation. Irene needed to find somewhere she could stay, at least temporarily. She couldn't go to family members because of the custody situation and her ongoing drug use. She couldn't afford a hotel. She was essentially homeless, dependent on the kindness of friends who were themselves barely getting by. The eviction represented more than just losing a home. It was another step down in a spiral that had been accelerating for months. First the children, then Bobby's arrest, now the apartment. Each loss made the next one more likely, created more instability, made recovery harder. Irene was exhausted, physically and emotionally. The methamphetamine kept her moving, but beneath the artificial energy was desperation and fear about what would happen next. Carrie Lynn Dalton had been accusing Irene of stealing her jewelry for some time. The accusation wasn't new, but it hung between them like a loaded gun, creating tension that neither woman seemed willing or able to diffuse directly. Whether the jewelry was actually missing, whether Irene had actually taken it, these were questions that would later be debated in court and remain unresolved even now. But the accusation itself was real, and in Carrie's mind, it was a fact. Carrie didn't make idle accusations. When she believed someone had wronged her, she didn't let it go. The jewelry supposedly included pieces that had sentimental value to Carrie, items she claimed were irreplaceable. She had told multiple people about the theft, building a narrative where Irene was not just a thief, but someone who had betrayed their friendship. In the world they inhabited, where material possessions were often temporary, and trust was a valuable commodity, theft among friends was considered a serious violation. Carrie's accusations weren't just about the monetary value of the jewelry. They were about respect, loyalty, and what she perceived as a fundamental betrayal. Irene denied taking the jewelry, but her denials did nothing to change Carrie's mind. The accusation created a dangerous dynamic where Carrie felt justified in her anger, and Irene found herself in a position where she couldn't prove her innocence. The tension between them grew over the days leading up to June 26th, but both women continued to move in the same social circles, their paths crossing repeatedly despite the obvious hostility. On the evening of June 26th, Cheryl, Irene, and the man known as George were planning to pick up methamphetamine. Getting drugs required transportation, connections, and usually someone with money or something to trade. They needed to meet with a dealer, complete the transaction, and get back before the night got too late. It should have been a routine trip, the kind of errand that happened constantly in their world. Their paths converged with Carrie and Mark unexpectedly. At around 5 p.m., Baker, May, and George went to a convenience store to meet May's connection for drugs. While waiting, Baker called Dalton to report she had not found her missing jewelry. Dalton, who lived nearby, arrived shortly after with Mark Tompkins in a small yellow pickup truck. The group, Baker, Dalton, Tompkins, May, and George, decided to locate and steal a Trans Am owned by someone they knew. They claimed the car had been stolen first. Although May expressed fear of Dalton, she and George went along with Baker. Around 6 p.m., the group left in 2 trucks, Dalton and Tompkins in one, and Baker, George, and May in the other, with no plan discussed beyond stealing the car. They drove for hours before encountering Dalton's acquaintance, Joanne Fedor. Fedor, who had her 3- and 4-year-old children with her, had pulled over to the side of the road around 11:30 p.m. due to an electrical fire in her vehicle. Dalton offered to drive Fedor's children back to her home in case the fire worsened, and Fedor agreed. The group followed her home in the 2 trucks, but according to Baker, they soon got lost, and the truck carrying Dalton and Tompkins broke down. As a result, Dalton, Tompkins, and Fedor's children joined Baker, May, and George in George's truck, setting the stage for the events that would later unfold at Fedor's trailer. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. If you've made it this far into the story, leave a comment saying you're still here. Let's see who's following this case all the way through. Once they arrived at the trailer park, rather than going their separate ways, the group ended up at Joanne's mobile home. The group entered Joanne's home and stayed for a period of time. Drugs were used inside the trailer. Conversation happened. The atmosphere was tense, but not yet overtly violent. Joanne later described feeling uncomfortable, but not immediately threatened. These were people from the community, people who used drugs, but who hadn't given her specific reason to fear them. She tolerated their presence, probably hoping they would leave soon and allow her to get her children to bed. At some point during the time at Joanne's trailer, Carrie began searching through Irene's purse. This wasn't done with permission or subtlety. Carrie simply took Irene's purse and went through it systematically, looking for something. She claimed to have found her missing jewelry inside. Whether this was true or whether Carrie planted the jewelry or simply claimed to have found it, no one except Carrie can say for certain. But she announced the discovery to everyone present, holding up the items and declaring that her suspicions had been confirmed. Irene was a thief. The accusation was no longer just an accusation. In Carrie's mind and in her announcement to the group, it was now proven fact. The discovery, real or fabricated, gave Carrie the justification she felt she needed. Irene was not just a suspected thief, but a confirmed one. The betrayal was established, and in Carrie's worldview, betrayal required punishment. What happened next would be described years later in confessions and testimony, pieced together from multiple sources, each with their own motivations for telling or not telling the complete truth. Carrie demanded that Irene perform chores as punishment for stealing the jewelry. The demands were specific and humiliating, designed to establish dominance and make clear who was in control. Clean this mess. Move those items. Organize that area. The chores themselves were meaningless, but the act of forcing Irene to perform them was everything. It was about power, about making Irene submit, about demonstrating to everyone present that Carrie was in charge and that crossing her had consequences. Irene complied with the demands. Fear was evident in her body language, in the way she moved quickly to complete each task, in the way she avoided making eye contact with Carrie. She apologized repeatedly, trying to de-escalate the situation, trying to find some way back to safety. But apologies didn't satisfy Carrie. The punishment was just beginning. During this time, there was also discussion about Irene having hepatitis. The fact of her having the disease became another mark against her in Carrie's increasingly hostile narrative. Hepatitis was serious, contagious, something that required disclosure. Carrie accused Irene of hiding her condition, of putting others at risk, of being careless and selfish. The accusation added another layer to the list of Irene's supposed transgressions. Then Carrie accused Irene of being an informant, someone who might cooperate with law enforcement. In the world of drugs and crime, being labeled an informant was perhaps the worst accusation possible. It meant betrayal at the highest level, the kind of betrayal that could get people arrested, send them to prison, destroy their lives. Whether Carrie actually believed this or whether she was simply adding another justification for what she planned to do, the accusation was made. The combination of theft, disease, and potential cooperation with police created a perfect storm in Carrie's paranoid worldview. Irene had become, in Carrie's eyes, someone who not only deserved punishment, but someone whose continued existence posed a threat. The hours passed. The situation in Joanne's trailer grew increasingly tense. Irene was clearly terrified. At some point during a quiet moment, she confided in Joanne, away from the others. She told Joanne she was afraid for her life. She asked about ways to escape from the trailer park. Which roads led out? Which paths would be fastest? Where could she go if she needed to run? Joanne, sensing the genuine fear and the danger, explained the layout of the area. She told Irene which direction to go, which turns to make, how to get away quickly if needed. Irene even contemplated using a knife to defend herself if necessary. The thought of violence went against everything she wanted to be, but survival instincts were kicking in. She was trapped in a situation that was escalating, surrounded by people who were high on methamphetamine and becoming increasingly unpredictable. The knife represented a possibility, a tool for protection if everything went wrong. For a brief moment, there seemed to be hope that Irene might escape, that she might make it out of the trailer, get away from Carrie, and survive the night. If you're finding value in this content, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Understanding these complex cases matters, and your support helps bring attention to stories that deserve to be told. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future content. Cheryl and Mark left the trailer at some point, taking Joanne and her children with them. That's swell to drop the kids off at school, and then Cheryl and Mark came back. When they returned, the dynamic had shifted. Irene was left more isolated than before. The brief possibility of escape had closed. She was in Joanne's trailer with Carrie and George, and the opportunity to run had passed. The windows of possibility were narrowing, and everyone present could feel the situation darkening. What happened next comes primarily from confessions given years later. Confessions that would be dissected in court, questioned by defense attorneys, and ultimately accepted by a jury, despite the absence of physical evidence. The confessions were detailed and graphic, describing hours of torture and violence. But they came from people who were themselves facing serious charges, people who had motivation to cooperate with prosecutors, people whose memories were affected by methamphetamine use. The defense would argue these confessions were unreliable, coerced, or fabricated. The prosecution would argue they were truthful accounts from witnesses who had no reason to provide such specific details unless they were real. According to Cheryl Baker's later testimony, Carrie conceived of a plan to inject Irene with battery acid. Battery acid is sulfuric acid, a corrosive substance that causes severe chemical burns. The idea of injecting it into someone's body was horrific, designed to cause maximum pain and suffering. Carrie pressured Cheryl to participate, to be the one to administer the injection. Cheryl would later describe pleading against this, expressing horror at the idea, trying to find some way to refuse without triggering Carrie's anger against her as well. Irene reportedly begged for her life during this time. She pleaded with Carrie, with Cheryl, with anyone who would listen. She apologized for whatever she had done, real or imagined. She promised she would leave and never come back. She offered to do anything to make the situation right, but Carrie was insistent. The decision had been made. Irene's fate was sealed in Carrie's mind, and nothing Irene could say would change it. A needle was prepared. Battery acid was drawn into a syringe. The attempt was made to inject Irene with the corrosive substance, but the needle failed to penetrate properly, or the acid didn't inject as planned. The method failed from a technical standpoint, but the intent had been clear. The attempt had been made. Irene now knew with absolute certainty that Carrie intended to kill her, and that the death would not be quick or merciful. The violence escalated from there. At that time, Mark and Cheryl had come back. Carrie ensured that Cheryl was a part of it, so she would not eat them out. Mark used a breaker bar, a heavy metal tool typically used for automotive work, to beat Irene. A breaker bar is essentially a long metal pipe used to provide leverage when loosening tight bolts. In Mark's hands, it became a weapon. According to the confessions, he struck Irene repeatedly with the tool, causing severe trauma. The beating was brutal, methodical, designed to cause maximum damage. According to the confessions, Irene's kneecaps were shattered using a cast iron pan, the kind of ordinary kitchen implement found in any home. Cast iron is heavy and hard, and when used as a weapon, it can break bones easily. The targeting of the kneecaps was particularly cruel, ensuring that even if Irene somehow survived, she would be unable to walk, unable to escape. The act demonstrated a level of calculation in the violence, a deliberate choice to disable and torment rather than simply kill quickly. An electric heater was modified for use as a torture device. The heating element was exposed, wires were stripped or arranged to allow direct contact with Irene's body. According to the confessions, this improvised electrical device was used to electrocute Irene repeatedly. Electrical burns are distinctively painful, causing muscle contractions and tissue damage that extends beyond the visible burn marks. The use of electrocution suggested a desire to prolong suffering, to make the dying process as painful as possible. Irene was stabbed with a knife multiple times. The stabbings came after the beatings, after the attempted acid injection, after the electrocution. By this point, according to the confessions, Irene was severely injured, possibly barely conscious. The stabbings would have been the final assault, the wounds that ultimately caused her death through blood loss and organ damage. The attack was prolonged, lasting hours according to later testimony. It was brutal in ways that are difficult to comprehend. It was methodical, with different weapons and methods used systematically, and it involved multiple people, each participating at different levels, each making choices about whether to stop what was happening or to continue. When Irene Melanie May finally died, her body was rolled into a carpet. The use of carpet for body disposal is common enough that it's almost a cliché in crime stories, but the reality is that it provides a relatively easy way to move a body without leaving obvious evidence. The carpet concealed the blood and made the body easier to transport without arousing suspicion from anyone who might see them loading it into a vehicle. The group transported Irene's remains to a Native American reservation. The choice of disposal location was calculated. Native American reservations have complex jurisdictional issues, with overlapping authority between tribal police, federal authorities, and local law enforcement. The boundaries of jurisdiction can make investigations more complicated, and the remote nature of many reservation lands provides areas where bodies can be buried with less chance of discovery. According to later confessions, Irene's body was dismembered at the disposal site. Dismemberment serves multiple purposes in body disposal. It makes the remains easier to bury in multiple locations, which decreases the likelihood of complete discovery. It makes identification more difficult if partial remains are found, and it eliminates the most recognizable human form, making accidental discovery less likely. The confessions described burying body parts in multiple locations across the reservation land, spreading the remains to ensure that no single grave site would contain enough evidence to definitively prove murder. The disposal was calculated to prevent discovery, to ensure that no physical evidence would ever connect them to Irene's death. And indeed, despite later searches of areas identified in the confessions, Irene's body has never been found. No bones, no tissue, no physical evidence that she died or where she died. The absence of remains would become the central issue in the trial, the question that would divide people about whether justice was truly served. The perpetrators returned to Joanne's trailer after disposing of the body. The scene they left behind told a story even without words. Items were missing from Joanne's home, taken either as payment for use of her space or simply stolen during the chaos. The floor had been scrubbed, cleaned with the kind of thoroughness that suggests an attempt to remove evidence. But some things remained that couldn't be easily explained away. A bloody pillow sat in one corner of the trailer. Blood on fabric is difficult to clean completely, and the pillow showed obvious staining. A screwdriver rested on a counter, its purpose in the night's events unclear, but its presence noted. The modified electric heater with exposed wires sat disconnected, a piece of ordinary household equipment transformed into something sinister. These items would later be reported by Joanne to law enforcement, becoming crucial pieces of the prosecution's circumstantial case. Carrie offered explanations for the state of the trailer and the missing items when Joanne questioned what had happened. She claimed Irene had left voluntarily. She said the mess was from their drug use and the general chaos of too many people in a small space. She provided alternative narratives for every piece of suspicious evidence, explanations that might have been plausible if considered in isolation. And without a body, without blood evidence that law enforcement could document and analyze, her explanations couldn't be definitively disproven at that moment. When Joanne reported what she had witnessed to law enforcement, Deputy David Wilson responded at 9:02 p.m. on June 27, 1988. He arrived at the trailer and began investigating Joanne's claims. She told him about the group being in her home, about the tense atmosphere, about the items she had found after they left. She told him about the bloody pillow, the screwdriver, the modified heater. She described her concerns and suspicions about what might have happened. Deputy Wilson searched the trailer thoroughly. He looked for blood evidence that would corroborate Joanne's claims of violence. He examined the floor, the walls, the furniture. He looked in areas where blood might have pooled or been missed during cleaning, but he found nothing. No blood evidence that he could document. No obvious signs of violence beyond the items Joanne had pointed out. The lack of physical evidence didn't mean nothing had happened, but it meant there was nothing concrete he could use to justify arrests or to pursue charges at that moment. Joanne herself was under an influence at the time of the deputy's visit. Her speech patterns, her emotional state, her ability to present a clear and linear narrative were all affected by the drug in her system. Deputy Wilson noted her condition in his report, which would later be used to question her credibility. If she was high when she made the report, how reliable was her memory? How much of what she described was real, and how much might have been paranoia or hallucination? The deputy's report noted the presence of drug paraphernalia throughout the trailer, confirming that drug use had occurred. But there was no clear evidence of violence. No blood that could be documented and tested. No body. No weapon that was obviously connected to a crime. The report essentially documented Joanne's concerns, but found no physical evidence to support them. The case went nowhere at that moment, filed away as the report of a concerned citizen who might have witnessed something suspicious, but who couldn't provide enough evidence to justify further investigation. Carrie provided explanations to others in the community about what had happened to Irene. She told people that Irene had left voluntarily, that she had decided to go stay with other friends or family. She said that the tension between them had been resolved, that they had talked things out, and that Irene had simply moved on. These explanations were accepted by many people because they were plausible. In a community where people frequently moved around, where living situations were often temporary, where someone might disappear for days or weeks without it being remarkable, Irene's absence didn't immediately trigger alarm bells. The group took additional steps to cover their tracks in the days following June 26th. Murder tools were disposed of in various locations. The breaker bar, the knife, the syringe, any items that might have been used in the crime were gotten rid of, thrown into dumpsters or waterways where they would never be recovered. They checked into a hotel, establishing an alibi for their whereabouts during the critical time period. If anyone asked where they had been, they could point to hotel records showing they were elsewhere. There was even discussion among the group about blowing up Joanne's trailer to destroy any remaining evidence. Fire is an effective way to destroy blood evidence, DNA, any traces that might connect them to a crime scene. But the plan was abandoned because Joanne's children were still living in the trailer, and even in their paranoid and violent state, the group drew a line at killing children. The decision not to burn the trailer would later prove significant, as it left some evidence intact that could be documented, even if that evidence wasn't enough to definitively prove murder at the time. The perpetrators were simultaneously meticulous and reckless in their cover-up efforts. They understood enough about criminal investigation to know they needed to dispose of weapons and create alibis. But they also left witnesses alive, including Joanne, who could and eventually would testify against them. They cleaned the floor, but left a bloody pillow. They disposed of some evidence, but not all. The contradictions in their behavior suggested people who were operating under the influence of drugs, making decisions that seemed logical in the moment, but that left gaps and inconsistencies that would later be exploited by investigators. Irene's disappearance didn't immediately trigger an official missing person investigation. In the world she inhabited, people often went missing for days or weeks without it being remarkable. They moved between crash pads, stayed with different friends, sometimes deliberately avoided contact with authorities or family members. Irene had lost custody of her children and had been evicted from her apartment, so there was no regular place where her absence would be immediately noticed. Bobby was still in jail, unable to check on her or report her missing. Her family had been distanced by her drug use and the custody situation, but eventually, the absence did trigger concern. A Child Protective Services worker who had been handling Irene's custody case filed a missing person report. Irene had missed appointments regarding her children, something the CPS worker noted was unusual. Despite her struggles, Irene had been consistent about showing up for meetings related to getting her children back. Missing those appointments without explanation suggested something was wrong. The missing person report initiated an official investigation, bringing law enforcement's attention to Irene's disappearance in a more formal way. Bobby May complicated the timeline considerably when he was eventually interviewed. He claimed to have seen Irene in July 1988, weeks after the alleged murder had taken place on June 26, 27. If his testimony was accurate, it would mean Irene hadn't been killed when prosecutors claimed. It would mean she had survived and was alive weeks later. Bobby was specific in his claim, insisting that he had seen her, talked to her, that she was definitely alive in July. The prosecution would later argue that Bobby was mistaken about the dates, that his memory was affected by his own drug use and the chaos of his life at that time. They suggested he might have seen her in June and misremembered it as July. They also raised the possibility that Bobby was lying, perhaps because he had been involved in her disappearance in some way, or perhaps because he couldn't accept that she was gone. But Bobby's testimony created reasonable doubt, a crack in the narrative that the defense would later exploit during trial. If a jury believed Bobby, or even if they simply weren't sure whether to believe him, that uncertainty could be enough to prevent a conviction. Years passed after Irene's disappearance. The case went cold, like many missing person cases do when there's no body and no clear evidence of foul play. But investigations continued quietly, and eventually, someone decided to cooperate with law enforcement. Cheryl Ann Baker, facing her own legal troubles, made the decision to confess to what had happened that night in June 1988. Cheryl's confession was detailed, graphic, and deeply incriminating. She described the events of June 26 to 27 in the kind of specific detail that prosecutors dream of from witnesses. She described the battery acid plan, explaining how Carrie had conceived of the idea and pressured her to participate. She described her own horror and reluctance, her attempts to refuse, and her ultimate compliance out of fear of Carrie. She described the beatings that Mark administered, the weapons used, the systematic torture that lasted for hours. She described Irene's pleas for mercy, her begging for her life, her promises to disappear and never tell anyone what had happened. Cheryl described the moment of Irene's death, the disposal of the body, the trip to the reservation, the dismemberment, and burial of remains in multiple locations. She provided specific geographical details about where they had gone, which roads they had taken, approximately where the remains had been buried. She described the return to Joanne's trailer, the cleanup efforts, the disposal of weapons. She described the hotel they checked into afterward, the conversations they had about what to do next, the abandoned plan to blow up the trailer. Her confession was the kind of breakthrough that prosecutors had been waiting for. It provided a narrative that explained Irene's disappearance, that accounted for the suspicious circumstances Joanne had reported, that filled in the gaps that had prevented charges from being filed years earlier. But Cheryl's confession also came with complications. She was facing serious charges herself, charges unrelated to Irene's disappearance but serious enough that cooperation could significantly reduce her sentence. Defense attorneys would later argue that she had every motivation to tell prosecutors what they wanted to hear, to create a narrative that would satisfy them and earn her leniency. Cheryl implicated Mark, Carrie, and George in her confession. She described their respective roles, who did what, who gave orders, Who carried out the violence? She portrayed Carrie as the mastermind, the person who conceived of the plan and directed others to carry it out. She portrayed Mark as the muscle, the person who administered the most severe physical beatings. She portrayed George as a participant whose exact role was less clear but who was present and involved. And she portrayed herself as someone who had been terrified, who had tried to refuse, but who ultimately participated out of fear for her own safety. Mark Lee Tompkins also confessed to law enforcement. His confession corroborated many of Cheryl's claims, providing a second source for key details. Mark described the events similarly, confirming the battery acid attempt, the beatings, the torture, the disposal of the body. His confession added details that Cheryl hadn't mentioned and confirmed details that she had. The consistency between their accounts gave prosecutors confidence that they were hearing the truth, or at least a version close enough to the truth to build a case. But Mark refused to testify in court. He was willing to confess to law enforcement in private interviews, but he would not take the stand at trial. His reasons for refusing were never made entirely clear. Perhaps he feared retaliation from Carrie or others. Perhaps he didn't want to face cross-examination by defense attorneys who would try to discredit him. Perhaps he simply didn't want to relive the events in a public courtroom. Whatever his reasons, his refusal to testify created a problem for prosecutors. Without his testimony, his confession could potentially be considered inadmissible hearsay, statements made outside of court that couldn't be cross-examined or challenged. The defense would argue that Mark's confession was unreliable, possibly coerced, and that without him testifying, the jury should give it little weight. Carrie Lynn Dalton maintained her complete innocence throughout the investigation and would continue to maintain it through trial and beyond. She claimed she had nothing to do with Irene's disappearance. She denied being present when any violence occurred. She suggested that Irene had left voluntarily and that the confessions from Cheryl and Mark were fabricated. She portrayed herself as someone being scapegoated by drug addicts who were lying to reduce their own sentences. She claimed that the investigation was flawed, that law enforcement had fixated on her without real evidence, and that the confessions were the result of coercion and promises of leniency. Carrie's defense strategy was to attack the credibility of every witness against her. She pointed out that Cheryl and Mark were both drug addicts with criminal records who had obvious motivation to lie. She pointed out that Joanne had been high when she reported suspicious circumstances to law enforcement. She emphasized that no body had ever been found, that no physical evidence definitively proved Irene was dead, let alone that Carrie had killed her. She argued that the entire case was built on a foundation of unreliable testimony from people who couldn't be trusted. Multiple witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts during the investigation. Some people claimed to have seen Irene after June 26th, supporting the theory that she was still alive. Others recalled conversations or events that seemed to support Cheryl's version of what happened. The conflicting testimony created a confusing picture where it seemed impossible to determine who was telling the truth and who was mistaken or lying. Methamphetamine use was a common thread running through nearly every witness, affecting memory, perception, and credibility. The forensic challenges facing investigators were immense. Without a body, there was no DNA evidence to analyze. There was no way to definitively determine cause of death. There were no bone fractures to document, no stab wounds to measure, no tissue to test for chemical burns from battery acid. The murder weapons had been disposed of, so there were no tool marks to match, no blood to recover from weapon surfaces. The carpet used to transport the body was gone. The trailer where the murder allegedly occurred had been occupied by other people in the years since, contaminating any potential crime scene evidence. Even the searches of the Native American reservation where Cheryl claimed the body had been buried yielded nothing. Investigators used her descriptions to identify areas where remains might be located. They brought in cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar, and forensic anthropologists. They dug in multiple locations, but they found nothing. The reservation land is vast, the terrain is difficult, and years of weather and natural decomposition would have scattered and degraded any remains that were there. The failure to find the body didn't prove Cheryl was lying, but it meant there was no physical evidence to confirm her story. The case went to trial in 1995, 7 years after Irene's disappearance. The prosecution faced the challenge of proving murder without a body,
without physical evidence, relying almost entirely on the testimony of accomplices who had obvious motivation to cooperate. The defense faced the challenge of explaining away detailed confessions and the fact that Irene had completely vanished from all records, all contact with family, all government systems that would normally document a person's continued existence. The prosecution presented their circumstantial case methodically, building it piece by piece. They started with Irene's life before June 26th, establishing who she was, what her circumstances were, why her disappearance was significant. They emphasized that she was a mother who had been fighting to regain custody of her children, that she had been showing up for appointments and making efforts to comply with Child Protective Services requirements. They argued that her sudden complete disappearance was inconsistent with someone who was trying to get her children back. Prosecutors pointed to Cheryl's detailed confession as the centerpiece of their case. They walked the jury through every element of her testimony, noting the consistency of detail, the specificity of her descriptions, the way her account matched physical evidence like the items found at Joanne's
trailer. They argued that no one could fabricate such a detailed narrative unless they had actually been present for the events described. They emphasized the gruesome details, the specific weapons used, the sequence of violence, arguing that these details had the ring of truth precisely because they were so horrific and specific. The prosecution noted that Irene had vanished from all official databases after June 26, 1988. She never collected welfare benefits again, never applied for government assistance, never renewed identification documents, never appeared in any law enforcement databases. For someone who had been actively involved with Child Protective Services, who had been receiving benefits, who had been documented in the system, this complete disappearance was significant. They argued that the only reasonable explanation for such a complete vanishing was death. Prosecutors presented financial records showing that Irene never accessed bank accounts or received payments that would normally show up if she were alive and working. They presented testimony from family members who said they never heard from her again after late June 1988, despite previous regular contact. They presented records from Child Protective Services showing missed appointments that Irene would not have missed voluntarily, given her desperation to regain custody of her children. The prosecution presented a handwritten note that was allegedly connected to the crime. It was additional evidence supporting their theory of what had happened. They presented testimony from other people in the drug community who had heard Carrie making threats against Irene, establishing motive and demonstrating Carrie's capacity for violence. The prosecution called Joanne Fedor to testify about what she had witnessed on the night of June 26-27. Joanne described the group coming to her trailer, the tense atmosphere, the chores Carrie forced Irene to perform, the fear evident in Irene's demeanor. She described Irene confiding in her about wanting to escape, about feeling her life was in danger. She described the items she found after the group left, the bloody pillow, the modified heater, the general disarray. Her testimony provided corroboration for key elements of Cheryl's confession, showing that something significant had happened that night, even if she hadn't witnessed the actual violence. The defense countered with attacks on every element of the prosecution's case. They emphasized repeatedly that there was no body, no physical proof that Irene was dead, no DNA evidence, no bones, no tissue, nothing concrete that proved a murder had occurred. They argued that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and that Irene's disappearance could have many explanations that didn't involve murder. Perhaps she had voluntarily disappeared to escape her problems. Perhaps she had relocated to another state. Perhaps she was living under a different identity. Without a body, they argued, the prosecution couldn't even definitively prove that a crime had occurred. The defense attacked the credibility of Cheryl Baker relentlessly. They emphasized that she was a drug addict who had been facing serious charges when she decided to confess. They pointed out that she received a plea deal in exchange for her testimony, reducing her potential sentence from life in prison to just 15 years. They argued that she had obvious motivation to tell prosecutors whatever they wanted to hear, to create a narrative that would satisfy them and earn her leniency. They suggested that her detailed confession could have been fabricated or enhanced, based on information she had learned from law enforcement during questioning. The details could have been inadvertently fed to her through leading questions. The defense similarly attacked Mark's credibility and the reliability of his confession. They emphasized that he refused to testify, which meant his statements couldn't be cross-examined or challenged in court. They argued that confessions obtained from drug addicts facing serious charges are inherently unreliable, that people in those circumstances will say anything to reduce their sentences. They pointed out inconsistencies between Mark's confession and Cheryl's, small details that didn't quite match, suggesting that if they were telling the truth, their stories would align more perfectly. The defense pointed to potential police misconduct in the investigation. They argued that the investigation had been sloppy, that evidence had been mishandled or improperly documented, that witness statements had been taken in ways that could have contaminated their testimony. They emphasized that the original response by Deputy Wilson found no blood evidence at the scene, no concrete proof that violence had occurred. They suggested that the entire investigation was built on the unreliable foundation of confessions obtained years after the fact from people with motivation to fabricate stories. The defense challenged the searches of the reservation land where the body was allegedly buried. They pointed out that despite extensive searching with professional equipment and expertise, nothing was found. They argued that this failure to locate remains called into question whether Cheryl's confession was accurate. If she really knew where the body was buried, if she had actually been there during the disposal, why couldn't she lead investigators to the remains? It was emphasized throughout the trial that the entire case was circumstantial. Every piece of evidence could be explained in ways that didn't involve Carrie killing Irene. The confessions could be fabricated. Irene's disappearance could be voluntary. The items at Joanne's trailer could have innocent explanations. Taken individually, no single piece of evidence proved murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution was asking the jury to connect many weak pieces of circumstantial evidence and conclude that they collectively proved murder. The defense argued that this wasn't enough, that reasonable doubt existed throughout. The judge himself commented on the ambiguity and unusual nature of the case during proceedings. He acknowledged that no body murder cases are rare and controversial, that they place unusual burdens on both the prosecution and the defense. He noted that the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt must be maintained even in cases where physical evidence is absent. His comments reflected the complexity of the legal and moral questions at the heart of the trial. The jury deliberated on whether the evidence presented was sufficient to convict Carrie Lynn Dalton of first-degree murder. They had to weigh the detailed confessions against the complete absence of physical evidence. They had to evaluate the credibility of drug-addicted witnesses against the presumption of innocence. They had to decide whether the circumstantial evidence, taken as a whole, proved guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The jury reached a verdict. They found the evidence sufficient to convict. Carrie Lynn Dalton was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury also found true the special circumstances allegations of torture and lying in wait, factors that made her eligible for the death penalty under California law. The torture allegation was based on the prolonged nature of the violence described in the confessions, the use of multiple methods designed to inflict maximum pain, the hours of suffering Irene allegedly endured. The lying in wait allegation was based on Carrie allegedly planning the murder in advance, waiting for the right opportunity, creating a situation where Irene was trapped and vulnerable. The sentencing phase of the trial followed the conviction. The prosecution argued for the death penalty based on the heinous nature of the crime, the special circumstances findings, Carrie's criminal history, and the lack of mitigating factors. The defense argued for life in prison without parole, emphasizing lingering doubts about the reliability of the evidence, the unusual nature of a no-body conviction, and factors from Carrie's background that might explain her behavior without excusing it. The jury recommended death. The judge accepted the recommendation and sentenced Carrie Lynn Dalton to death. Cheryl Ann Baker, in exchange for her cooperation and testimony, received a sentence of 15 years in prison. Mark Lee Tompkins, who confessed but refused to testify, received 25 years to life. George, the unidentified male who was allegedly present during the crime, was never found and never charged. His identity remains unknown to this day. Carrie's case went through the lengthy appeals process that is standard in death penalty cases. Her attorneys raised numerous issues on appeal, challenging the sufficiency of the evidence, the reliability of witness testimony, the admission of certain evidence, and the fairness of the trial proceedings. Some appeals were denied. Others resulted in remands for reconsideration of specific issues. In 2019, the California Supreme Court vacated Carey's death sentence. The court found issues with the trial proceedings that required the death sentence to be set aside. The specific legal grounds for this decision involved technical aspects of California death penalty law and trial procedure. The vacation of the sentence didn't mean Carey was found innocent or that her conviction was overturned. It meant that the death sentence specifically could not stand based on how it had been imposed. Carey remains incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California, serving a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. Carey continues to maintain her complete innocence. She has given interviews over the years insisting that she had nothing to do with Irene's disappearance, that the confessions from Cheryl and Mark were lies, that she has been wrongly convicted. Her sister, Victoria Thorpe, has become a vocal advocate for her case. Victoria argues that the conviction was fundamentally unjust, that no one should be sentenced to death or even to life in prison, based solely on the testimony of admitted accomplices without physical evidence to corroborate their claims. Victoria has pointed to the absence of a body as proof that reasonable doubt exists. She has highlighted inconsistencies in witness testimony, the drug use that affected everyone involved, and what she sees as flaws in the investigation and trial. She has advocated for Carey's case to be reviewed, for new investigations to be conducted, for the conviction to be overturned. Her advocacy has brought attention to the broader questions about no-body murder convictions and the standards of proof required when physical evidence is absent. Irene Melanie May's body has never been found, despite multiple searches over the years. Law enforcement has conducted searches of the reservation land where Cheryl claimed the remains were buried. They have used various technologies and techniques, bringing in experts and spending considerable resources trying to locate physical evidence. But the searches have yielded nothing. The vast expanse of the reservation, combined with years of environmental changes, decomposition, and potential animal activity, means that remains could be scattered and degraded beyond recognition, or located in areas that haven't been searched. The absence of remains means there can be no forensic confirmation of cause of death. There can be no DNA analysis to definitively prove identity. There can be no examination of bones for fracture patterns, no tissue analysis for chemical burns, no physical evidence to corroborate the specific methods of violence described in confessions. The case exists in a strange legal space, where a murder conviction and life sentence stand despite the absence of the most fundamental piece of evidence in any homicide case. The Irene Melanie May case raises profound questions about the American justice system and how we balance the need to punish criminals with the requirement of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Can justice truly be served when evidence is entirely circumstantial and key witnesses are unreliable drug addicts with motivation to lie? Should someone be sentenced to death or to life in prison, based primarily on the confessions of co-conspirators who received reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony? The question of whether no-body murder convictions should be allowed at all is debated among legal scholars and advocates. Supporters argue that dangerous criminals shouldn't escape justice simply because they were successful in hiding a body. They point out that circumstantial evidence can be compelling and reliable, that the totality of evidence can prove guilt even without physical remains. They note that requiring a body for murder convictions would essentially provide a roadmap for criminals to avoid prosecution by ensuring complete disposal of remains. Critics argue that the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt requires physical evidence in murder cases, that the risk of wrongful conviction is too high when relying solely on testimony from accomplices. They point to cases where confessions have later been proven false, where witnesses have recanted, where convictions based on testimony alone have been overturned by new evidence. They argue that the death penalty especially should require absolute certainty, and that certainty is impossible without a body. The case also raises questions about human psychology and behavior under extreme circumstances. Cheryl Baker participated in or witnessed horrific violence. Her later confession portrayed her as someone who had been terrified of Carey, who had tried to refuse participation but ultimately complied out of fear for her own safety. To what extent was she culpable for her actions? Was she a victim of manipulation and psychological coercion, or was she an active participant who later minimized her role to gain leniency? Mark Tompkins followed Carrie's direction in administering brutal beatings. His confession suggested he was acting out of loyalty and fear, carrying out orders from someone he was emotionally and psychologically bound to. Does that explanation mitigate his responsibility? At what point does following orders become an excuse rather than an explanation? How do we assign moral responsibility when addiction, fear, and psychological coercion are all factors? And then there's Carrie Lynn Dalton herself. If the confessions are accurate, she conceived of and orchestrated a prolonged torture and murder based on a perceived theft and paranoid beliefs about informants. Her actions would represent a level of cruelty and calculated violence that's difficult to comprehend. The planning involved, the various methods of torture employed, the disposal of the body, all suggest someone capable of extraordinary evil. But if she's innocent, as she maintains, then she has spent decades in prison for a crime she didn't commit, facing execution based on false testimony from people who may have actually killed Irene or who fabricated the entire story for reasons of their own. The case highlights the particular challenges of crimes that occur within communities struggling with addiction. Nearly everyone involved in this case, from victim to perpetrators to witnesses, was using methamphetamine at the time of the alleged crime. That drug use affected memory, perception, decision-making, and the reliability of testimony. Methamphetamine can cause paranoia, hallucinations, and memory distortions. It can make people suggestible to leading questions during interrogations. It creates an environment where violence can escalate quickly, and where normal social bonds that might prevent such crimes are weakened or destroyed. The drug culture also created circumstances where people were transient, where disappearances weren't immediately remarkable, where official documentation and contact with authorities was minimal. Irene could vanish without immediate alarm bells, because people in her world often moved around without notice. The delayed discovery of her disappearance meant that by the time investigators were looking for evidence, months or years had passed, potential crime scenes had been contaminated, witnesses' memories had faded or been influenced by subsequent events and conversations. Irene Melanie May was a mother who loved her children and desperately wanted to get them back. She was a young woman trapped by addiction, but still fighting for something better, still showing up for appointments, still trying to navigate the requirements of Child Protective Services to prove she could be a stable parent. Whether she died on June 26, 1988, in the brutal manner described in confessions, or whether something else happened entirely, may never be fully known with absolute certainty. Her family never got closure in the conventional sense. There was no body to bury, no grave to visit, no funeral where they could say goodbye and begin processing their grief. Her 3 children grew up without their mother, without even physical remains to confirm what happened to her. The ambiguity of her fate adds another layer of trauma to the loss, the inability to ever know for certain exactly what happened and where she is. The 3 people convicted in connection with her disappearance have given varying and sometimes conflicting accounts over the years. Cheryl provided the detailed confession that formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, but she was also the person who benefited most from cooperating, receiving just 15 years when she could have faced life. Mark confessed but refused to testify, leaving questions about what he would have said under oath and cross-examination. Carrie has maintained complete innocence from the beginning, never wavering in her claims that she had nothing to do with Irene's disappearance. And somewhere, if the confessions are accurate, Irene's remains lie scattered across a Native American reservation, unmarked and unfound. The landscape has changed in the decades since 1988. Weather has eroded soil, vegetation has grown and died, animals have moved across the land. The specific locations described in confessions may have been approximations, memories affected by drugs and time, and the stress of confession. The remains, if they exist where Cheryl claimed, may be degraded beyond recognition, scattered by natural processes, buried under layers of accumulation. The controversy at the heart of this case endures more than 3 decades after Irene's disappearance. No body murder convictions remain rare and controversial, requiring juries to take a leap of faith beyond what's typically asked in criminal cases. They must believe testimony and circumstantial evidence without the anchor of physical proof that normally grounds murder prosecutions. They must be convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder occurred, even though the most fundamental evidence, the victim's body, cannot be produced. Advocates for Carrie Dalton argue that the standard of proof should be higher when physical evidence is completely absent. They argue that execution especially should require absolute certainty, the kind of certainty that can only come from physical evidence that definitively proves not just that someone died, but how they died and who killed them. They point to the history of wrongful convictions in cases that seemed strong at trial, but were later overturned by DNA evidence, or recanted testimony, or new witnesses coming forward. They argue that irreversible punishments like execution require irreversible proof. Prosecutors and victims' advocates argue that dangerous criminals shouldn't escape justice simply because they were thorough in disposing of evidence. They note that requiring physical remains for murder convictions would essentially provide criminals with a guarantee of immunity if they could successfully hide or destroy a body. They argue that circumstantial evidence, when considered as a whole rather than as individual pieces, can prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They point to the detailed confessions in this case, the consistency between different witnesses, the physical evidence that was found at Joanne's trailer, and Irene's complete disappearance from all records, as collectively proving that she was murdered and that Carrie orchestrated it. Was justice truly served in the case of Irene Melanie May? The answer depends on what you believe about the evidence presented, about the credibility of witnesses, about the standards that should apply in murder cases without bodies. If you believe Cheryl's confession was truthful, if you believe the totality of circumstantial evidence proved Carrie's guilt beyond reasonable doubt, then justice was served when Carrie was convicted and sentenced. The fact that her death sentence was later vacated doesn't change the underlying conviction, only the specific punishment. But if you have doubts about the reliability of confessions from drug addicts seeking plea deals, if you believe physical evidence should be required for murder convictions, if you think Bobby May's testimony about seeing Irene alive in July creates too much uncertainty, then justice may not have been served. Carrie may be an innocent woman serving life in prison for a crime she didn't commit, convicted based on false testimony from people who had motivation to lie. The case serves as a stark reminder of how addiction destroys lives and communities in ways that extend far beyond individual drug use. The methamphetamine culture created an environment where Irene was vulnerable, where violence could occur with multiple witnesses but still remain hidden from authorities, where people's memories and testimony would later be questionable. It created circumstances where a mother could vanish and weeks could pass before anyone filed a missing person report. It damaged the lives of everyone it touched, from Irene who lost her life, to her children who lost their mother, to the perpetrators who threw away their own lives through violence, to witnesses like Joanne who were traumatized by what they saw. George was never identified, never found, never charged, remaining a mystery and a loose thread that investigators could never resolve. And Irene's body has never been found, leaving her final resting place unknown, and her exact fate uncertain despite the conviction. This is the story of Irene Melanie May, a 23-year-old mother who vanished on June 26, 1988, and whose case became one of the most controversial no-body murder convictions in California history. A story of addiction and violence and betrayal. A story of a justice system pushed to its limits, forced to decide guilt or innocence based on testimony from unreliable witnesses without the physical evidence that normally anchors such decisions. A story where doubt persists despite a verdict, where questions remain despite a conviction, and where a young mother's fate became a legal and philosophical challenge that continues decades later. If this story has impacted you, or if you believe these complex cases deserve attention and discussion, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who might find it thought-provoking. Understanding these difficult cases helps us think critically about justice, evidence, and the systems we rely on to determine truth. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe justice was served when Carrie Dalton was convicted, or do you think there's reasonable doubt about her guilt? Do you think no-body murder convictions should be allowed, or do you believe physical remains should be required for such serious charges? Your perspective matters, and these discussions help us all engage more deeply with questions that have no easy answers.